What does the landscape look like now when we think about the regulation of procurement at a local government level? And this is really what we're talking about. So we've got right at the top, of course, the Constitution, which we know primarily in Section 217 tells us a lot about procurement. For local government, I think it is particularly important to remember that it's not just Section 217 of the Constitution that is of critical importance. I think that there are many other sections in the Constitution, especially with local government, that we often neglect when we talk about SCM and the Constitution and local government. So I think it's important to bear all of those in mind, because in the local government context, especially the service delivery mandate that comes directly from the Constitution is very much implicated when we talk about procurement. So I think it's very important for all of us to remember that alongside 217, there are a host of other really important constitutional provisions that would also be implicated in SCM at a local government level. But then if we talk a little bit more specifically, we've got then directly under the Constitution, the Municipal Finance Management Act, which has got in Chapter 11 quite a bit of detailed rules on SCM. And those are then further fleshed out in the Municipal Supply Chain Management Regulations, which are made in pursuance of Chapter 11 in the MFMA. And again, a lot of detail in the Municipal Supply Chain Management Regulations. They are probably our most detailed hard procurement rules we've got in the South African procurement system. They, however, only inform, for the most part, the SCM policy, and the SCM policy informs procurement decisions on the ground, right? So that's the main kind of line of rules in local government procurement as we know it at the moment, the kind of scheme. Alongside the MFMA, we then also, of course, have the PPPFA, the Preferential Procurement Policy Framework Act, which gives us another side of the procurement story. We're all very familiar with it, and we know that we always read the PPPFA with the MFMA. They're a package. They always work together. Under the PPPFA, we've got the preferential regulations, which we've got a brand new set now, the 2022 regulations, and they also just inform the SCM policy, or at least the preferential procurement policy that typically forms part of the SCM policy, which in turn informs your procurement decisions. Now, within that MFMA PPPFA space, we've also got a whole host of other secondary kind of instruments, typically called circulars, and they are weird and wonderful in the sense that they're created under any or all of these regulatory instruments. Sometimes it's quite difficult to figure out whether they're actually now created under the MFMA as opposed to the Municipal Supply Chain Management Regulations. Be that as it may, they all influence your SCM policy at local government level, but very importantly, this is an important point to note for our purposes today, is that as things currently stand, circulars in local government context are not binding per se. That means that when they're issued, typically by National Treasury, they are not automatically binding on local government. They just guide, they give advice, they give guidance on how all these other instruments are meant to be interpreted and are meant to inform your SCM policy, but they're not binding, they're not law. And then finally, the third major leg, and let me say, I'm just talking about the major instruments. There's, of course, a whole host of more specific, detailed other instruments alongside this main story. But then the third main actor in the story is the construction sector under the CIDB Act, the Construction Industry Development Board Act, which governs all construction procurement, which, of course, at local government level is also highly relevant. Under the CIDB Act, the CIDB has created a whole host of instrument standards and all kinds of different mechanisms, and they also inform your SCM policy, then specifically relating to construction or infrastructure procurement. One of the most important aspects of this picture in our current alignment of regulatory powers, which is distinct from all other levels of procurement in South Africa at the moment, is the fact that the council at local government level sits between this entire regulatory regime created in, either parliament or by way of regulation and the specific municipalities' SCM policy. So Our current regime is one where the council acts as the absolute filter for the specific rules applied at local government level. So what does this mean in practice? It means that whatever is issued at any level must go through the council to, in the end, become binding rules at that specific municipality's procurement function. And this is well illustrated, for example, with reference to these circulars or whatever other instruments are issued under these statutes, that they can only really become binding if the council adopts them. But the council at the moment has got the power to just say, no, we're not going to adopt this particular circular for whatever reason. And then it's not binding. And this is a distinct feature of procurement regulation at local government level. It's very different at the other levels. So if you think about more or less the equivalent of the council at other levels of government, then we can, for example, say that the MECs, the provincial executive, or the cabinet at national level, the ministers, got no power to prescribe the SCM policy of a department. The National Treasury simply prescribes it, and then the department is bound by an instruction, for example. So it's very different at local government level. So what will happen now with the reform that we're seeing is that the Public Procurement Act will replace that entire MFMA and PPPFA regime. It will just come and sit in the place of what we've got, but not the CIDB regime. The CIDB regime will remain. So the picture that will emerge following this reform as it is currently proposed will look like this. We will have directly under the Constitution the Public Procurement Act. Under the Act, there will be issued regulations as well as instructions, binding instructions. And those instructions can be issued by either this newly created body called the Public Procurement Office, which is basically the current OCPO with a different name, as well as provincial treasuries. And they've both got the power to issue directly binding instructions in SCM. And those regulations alongside these instructions will dictate the SCM policy, which will then determine the procurement decisions. It is the same picture for the entire South African state. So no longer will there be any differentiation between local government and the other levels of government. It will be a single regulatory regime. And very importantly, council will have no role to play whatsoever. It is probably the biggest shift in regulatory power proposed by this regime, and that is to take council, local government councils, completely out of the picture. Now, the first thing I want to just talk about is the shift in the regulatory regime, as I've shown you the picture now, and I just want to show you the actual law. So you see already in the preamble of this bill that it is meant to be a comprehensive and universal set of rules that will actually be covering everything. That is then made clear in the repeals. So in the schedule attached to the bill, you will see that there's a long table, and it tells us what will be repealed once this bill becomes an act. The first very important one for our purposes is that the PPPFA will be repealed in its entirety. That means not only the act itself, not only the PPPFA will just be gone, but also the preferential procurement regulations issued under it and all other instruments that might have been issued over time under the PPPFA will automatically disappear. The second one that is of critical importance for our conversation this morning is the repeal of the whole of Chapter 11 of the Municipal Finance Management Act. There's a longer list of particular sections that are either amended or repealed from the MFMA, just smaller kind of adjustments. I've just pulled out these two that you've got on the screen here. 35 is undoubtedly the most important one, because that then takes SCM completely out of the MFMA. So the MFMA will no longer specifically deal with SCM. SCM will henceforth be dealt under this particular piece of legislation that will sit alongside the general MFMA in terms of the financial implications. With that will also completely disappear the municipal supply chain management regulations, because those were made pointedly under Chapter 11. So if Chapter 11 disappears, the regulations disappear as well as all circulars issued over time under the MFMA dealing with ECM or under the municipal supply chain management regulations. So they will just all disappear. Interestingly, Section 2F of the MFMA is also repealed. And when you look at 2F, you'll see that it is the section that tells us that one of the objectives of the MFMA is also to deal with SCM in local government context. And that is repealed. That's completely taken away. So it's no longer the objective of the MFMA to deal with SCM. And that split between our general regulation of public finance at local government level and SCM, I think, is a really interesting one. And it's one that I think merits further engagement, further consideration, because it might suggest that we are at long last starting to shift away from a conceptualization of SCM or public procurement as purely a matter of public finance. And I think that's a good move. I think that's a positive sign. I think that it's still too close to public finance under the bill. And I think there's work to be done, but this splitting that we see quite clearly in the deletion of Section 2F from the MFMA is a good signal in that sense, that it's no longer just a matter of public finance. So I'm quite pleased with that development. But at the same time, there are interesting things that are not repealed. With other words, that remain under the new regime that I find somewhat problematic, if not puzzling. And I think that might, from a practical point of view, cause us some problems down the line. Now, I want to highlight just two for you here. The first one is that Section 33 of the MFMA, which is not part of Chapter 11, right? So it sits outside of Chapter 11. Chapter 11 starts at 111, Section 111. So 33 remains. It's only subsection 4 of Section 33 that's repealed, but the rest of 33 remains. Now, those of you familiar with this regulatory regime will immediately know Section 33. It is the quite problematic one that deals with future budgetary implications, specifically the one that's got implications beyond 3 years. So it's long-term contracts. And this has traditionally been a very difficult section to deal with at local government level, and it's mostly implicated through procurement, right? So it's a general section, it's not just procurement, also deals with other kinds of contracts. So it's all contracts having multi-year or long-term implications. But in practice, it is primarily procurement contracts, or it's contracts concluded by way of a procurement process that would have these long-term obligations, so that Section 33 is quite often closely tied to procurement at local government level. And it's a difficult section to implement. It's one that causes a lot of practical difficulties, not the least of which is the bottlenecks that it creates, and it remains. It will remain part of our new procurement regulatory regime. I think that might be problematic. I'm not sure that these two regimes will comfortably coexist. And I'm just wondering whether a little bit more thought should not perhaps be given to how we're going to deal with long-term contracts being procured in the local government context, and whether Section 33 remains the best mechanism to deal with that. An alternative might be to simply just shift our understanding of long-term contracts in procurement into the Procurement Act itself. So that's something to think about. The second thing to think about is that Section 62 of the Systems Act, the Local Government Systems Act, is not touched. It will remain under this regime. Now, 62, again, for those of you familiar, will know that this is the general appeals mechanism, and it's caused a lot of issues in procurement. There's a strong sense that this thing was never really designed with procurement in mind. It doesn't really work well in procurement for all kinds of difficult reasons, for which there's a very long line of cases where our courts have really struggled to implement and understand Section 62 in the procurement context. It works better in zoning and that kind of context, but not really in procurement. And it is curious that 62 is not touched by this new regime, in light of the fact that the new regime under the procurement bill creates a completely new dispute resolution mechanism that looks completely different from the 62 mechanism. So leaving 62 as is will undoubtedly create potential parallel dispute resolution mechanisms at local government context. It's a local government specific mechanism, this one in 62, and there's not a word on how we're going to deal with these competing jurisdictions, competing mechanisms. And I think that is going to be a disaster. So I think at the least, that is something we will have to think about in the procurement bill. My proposal to Parliament is going to be that the procurement bill should amend 62 to exclude all decisions taken under the Procurement Act from 62, so that one is forced to use the procurement bill's resolution mechanism rather than 62. But of course, you might have different views on that. Let us then just say a few words about oversight. I think this is also going to be an interesting new world for local government going forward. It's definitely got to be a different world. And for this, we need to quickly look at two sections, sections 5 and 6. 5 deals with the power of the Public Procurement Office. This is the new national unit sitting within National Treasury. So it's basically the OCPO with a new name. But now, unlike the current OCPO, this body gets distinct powers granted to it under the bill. So it will be a much more solidly based entity or unit within our architecture. Now, when we look at the powers of the PPO, you will see that it is comprehensive. There's really nothing carved out. So it talks about really doing all of the things that it is told to do in relation to all procuring institutions. And that would very much include also municipalities. So if you look at this section on the screen, you'll see it includes things like promote compliance with this act by procuring institutions. That would include municipalities. Promote standardization, right? So that's across the board. Intervene by taking appropriate steps to address a material breach by a procuring institution, again, would include local government. And then specifically under section 5.2, you see that there's the power granted to the Public Procurement Office to issue binding instructions in relation to any matter, and that would again be binding on municipalities, as well as to review policies. So again, that would include a municipality's policy. So there's this broad overarching power granted to the PPO across the entire system, including municipalities. But then, alongside this power, we see in section 6 specific powers given to provincial treasuries in relation to what is called procuring institutions within the province. Now, again, we will have to unpack what that means. The bill doesn't tell us, but I think it is fair to assume that that would include municipalities within the province. There's nothing in the bill that suggests to me that a municipality would be excluded from this category, that is, procuring institutions within the province. I think that is what it will mean, which means that the provincial treasuries will also have power in relation to municipalities within that province in relation to public procurement. And you'll see it really just mirrors the powers of the PPO at the general level. So what we will have under the Public Procurement Bill is that there will be 2 layers of oversight on municipal procurement by respectively the PPO and the provincial treasury. And this may mean that there might be different rules for different municipalities based on instructions, actions, implementation actions taken by a specific provincial treasury. So going forward, which again is distinct from what we've got now, there's a good likelihood that a municipality in the Western Cape will be subject to different rules of procurement than a municipality in the Eastern Cape or municipality in Gauteng, simply based on specific instructions issued by the provincial treasury. You will note, however, that Section 6 specifically subjects a provincial treasury's powers to that of the national PPO. So the provincial treasury will not be able to do anything that will be in conflict with anything done by the PPO, but at least to the extent that the PPO has not done anything or has done something just at a general level, a provincial treasury will be able to issue more specific instructions, or then issue instructions where there's nothing at the national level that would only be binding on the entities, including the municipalities in that province. So I think there's an important shift there. And there are questions, in my mind at least, between the power granted to the PPO in Section 5 regarding standardization and the explicit powers granted to provincial treasuries to differentiate on a provincial basis. And how those two are going to be squared at an administrative level, I think, might create difficulties, and something that I think we need to think about. Then, and this is really the last point I want to just talk about, procurement methods, really the nuts and bolts. Now, as we've said before in many conversations, there's very little on nuts and bolts in the bill itself. It kicks the can down the road by saying that the minister will basically prescribe this, meaning that there will be regulations. So we have to await the regulations to give us detail about how are we actually going to procure. Again, remember, these will now be binding on municipalities as well. There are, however, some important signals in the bill. The first one we find in Section 18, which gives the minister the power to prescribe procurement methods and procedures. And you see in 18.2 that must include rules on transversal term contracting, right? So centralized contracting. And importantly, it is contemplated then under 18.2b that at least some of those transversal contracts will be mandatory. It means that unlike anything we've seen up till now, municipalities may be forced into participation in centrally placed contracts. And that is, again, going to be a significant shift in the actual nuts and bolts on the ground of procurement. If, for example, the Public Procurement Office would simply place a national contract for the delivery of a particular product or service that municipalities also acquires or needs, and that might then become a mandatory participation. So a municipality will have to get it from that central term contract. And I think that's an important thing to bear in mind. The second thing that I think is really important to bear in mind is ICTs, information technology systems for procurement, really e-procurement. And we find in sections 24 and 25 quite extensive rules on the future of e-procurement. And again, I think local government is probably going to be the hardest hit by this, because I think local government has progressed furthest down the route in terms of bringing e-procurement to bear on their practices, simply because they've had more flexibility than any entity at national or provincial level. The bill contemplates that the Public Procurement Office will eventually, in time, develop a single e-procurement system. It means that everyone will have to participate in a single system. So whereas, for example, at the moment, municipalities have got the choice whether they want to participate or use in the central supply database, or rather use their own, they will no longer have that choice under the bill. The PPO will create that single central mechanism. And it, of course, would go well beyond the central supply database. It will be a complete suite of e-procurement systems, as you see here on the slide. But that's progressive. That is over time. In the meantime, even in the medium to short term, under Section 25, you see that the PPO, while it is creating the single central system, is tasked with prescribing to all entities, again, including municipalities, about how to use ICTs in their procurement. So I think that even though this big overhaul, this big step forward in terms of e-procurement that Section 24 contemplates is probably something that we won't see soon, kind of something for the future, I think the implication of Section 25 is that fairly quickly we will see also local governments being pulled into the central system. I can, for example, immediately see as a first immediate step that the CSD will become mandatory across the board, that the e-tender portal will become absolutely mandatory across the board, which for metros, for example, will be quite an important implication, quite an important step. And that will raise all kinds of questions about current contracts and current systems that are being run at local government level and what we're going to do with them and how we're going to migrate, etc., etc. And I don't think it is necessarily going to be plain sailing in shifting all of that. Right, so that's it from me in terms of substance. Let me then just quickly flag a few advertisements while you digest that and prepare your comments and questions and inputs. Firstly, we've still got a few more seats available for our upcoming procurement law conference. That's going to be in September in Cape Town. So those of you that's not signed up yet, please visit our website. We've still got some seats left, and get your registration in as soon as possible. Those will close fairly soon. And then I'm very happy to announce here, formally at least, that our international conference on public procurement and innovation, we've now formally launched the event, and it will take place on the 14th and the 15th of November this year in Pretoria at the offices, the headquarters of the National Research Foundation. It is an event, a major conference that our unit is collaborating with the National Research Foundation on. It is going to be at the highest level of international conferences. We have been able to secure participation from generally the leading global experts on the link between public procurement and innovation. Will be coming out to South Africa in November, coming to engage us on how are we going to shift the needle on linking public procurement and innovation in our system, on the continent generally, and then specifically in South Africa. It is going to be I think an absolute highlight in the procurement space for this year. Attendance will be free of charge, but seats are limited. So you will have to book your seat as soon as possible. They are going to be extremely sought after. And we've got an absolute limit, a capacity limit on how many people we can accommodate. So if they're all taken, they're all taken, right? So further details you will find also on our website, but the invites have started going out as of this morning. But you don't have to wait for a formal invite. You're welcome to simply just go to the website. You will find the registration link there. You will also find the long list of speakers that's already committed to participating, and that list is still growing. So please go and have a look at that. Sean, that's my story. So I'm quite keen to hear from everyone.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks, Prof Quinot, and fascinating points that you've raised. And let's immediately go. Sanele is joining us from a municipality in KZN. Welcome, Sanele. Your comments.
Good morning, colleagues. Morning, Prof.
Morning, Sanele.
Very interesting points. Thank you very much. I just wanted to highlight that, and I think we at the municipal space, there will be a very interesting point when it comes to transition from the current regime to this one. I'm looking at the points that you were raising towards your closing, where the mandatory participation on the transversal contracts will be applied. You know, if you look into that, I think firstly we must accept that there might be a piling irregular expenditure during the phase of rolling out the new Procurement Act, because the municipalities are not used to the instructing element of National Treasury and the Provincial Treasury. They are only used to, you know, a more softer approach, like a recommendation sort of approach towards them. So I do think that maybe also the treasuries needs to try and enhance the what you call the participation of the municipalities towards the, you know, the development of this public procurement bill, because also on their side they might be having a challenge in controlling what is going to happen now. But the gap that is currently evidenced, it's the municipalities are not necessarily on board with this process. They might find themselves having to just adjust abruptly to carry out the new instructions or the new legislation that will be seemingly difficult to accept. But I do think that probably the municipality may have a great deal of, you know, compliance towards the new regulations. That is my take.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anila. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with it. So, I mean, I've said in previous engagements that I'm curious to see what's going to happen with irregular expenditure findings as we transition under this bill. So my prediction is that what is going to happen is, as we go out of the current system into the new one, my prediction is that we will see for at least one audit year a dramatic dip in the number of irregular expenditures, and then soon after a dramatic rise again. And the reason I predict that is what will happen immediately when the new regime is introduced is that there will be very few, if any, instructions at that point in time. So it'll be a bare bones framework kind of regulatory regime. So there will be very little against which SCM expenditure can be checked to arrive at the conclusion that it's irregular. And I've always maintained that I think a lot of SCM irregular expenditure findings are driven by non-compliance with secondary instruments, not primary instruments. I don't think it's primary legislation that's breached. It's secondary legislation that's mostly breached in irregular expenditure findings. So that if there are a significant lower number of those secondary instruments, I think that's going to be lower. But then I think the point you just made is going to catch up with us. And the fact that we are bringing in 270 odd new entities, municipalities, plus their municipal entities, in a new regime that they're not that familiar with, I think is probably going to cause a sharp rise. And I think, you know, the point we were talking about right at the beginning of the session today around this new instruction on assignment is a case in point. I think one of the things that we will have to say to each other in our regime is that we will have to get much better at the formal aspect of these instruments. We cannot go on in this fairly informal thing of email and just on a website or something like that. There's just not enough certainty. So we will have to create a better way of firstly creating and then secondly publishing those instruments, because otherwise I think there's going to be significant problems.
Interesting. Thank you. Thank you. Let's bring in Raymond SR. Raymond is joining us all the way from a municipality in the Western Cape. Good morning.
Hi. Morning, Prof. I have quite a few issues, obviously, being in local government. I'm going to limit myself. Before I get to my issues that I want to mention, in particular, the things that are missing in the procurement bill affecting local government. The issue pertaining to Section 33 of the MFMA. Remember, Section 33 is in the section that deals with municipal budgets, and it's about budget and forward planning. So surely there must be a section in the budget provisions that deal with future budgeting. So currently, we are required in terms of law to budget for a 3-year period only. And we only get our DORA allocation and MIC allocations certainty for a period of 3 years. So there's no certainty beyond the period. And therefore, we cannot lawfully budget for a period beyond 3 years. I know that some municipalities have a 5-year or 10-year horizon, but it's not uncertainty. It's just mere setting out what they plan for in their strategic documents. But we can't actually budget beyond 3 years. Therefore, you can't put out a tender beyond the term for which you have budgeted. And that interplay with Section 33 is important. And that is why they probably left 33. But I agree that it's a cause of confusion and it should have been amended. Whether it should be in the procurement legislation is another question altogether, because it's key about the budget provision more than the procurement provision. So just that interplay. Second issue, well, the issue that I actually want to raise is the key issues about that you addressed about the circulars and instruction at MFMA level, quite different from PFMA level. At MFMA level, Section 168, subsection 3 of the MFMA clearly state that, as you said, it does not become binding unless the municipal council have approved it. But now under procurement regime, the argument is obviously now that when you look at procurement instructions, you shouldn't look at the MFMA for those. You will find your cue in the Procurement Act when it comes to see the light. However, subsection 168, subsection G, 1G of that Act, referred to the circulars and or guidelines being issued for alienation, letting, and disposal of assets under the MFMA still. And that has not been repealed, meaning that those provisions now in the procurement bill are double stated in both pieces of legislation, and surely confusion will instill. And secondly, as you said, in the MFMA, under the Municipal Finance Management Act, we had, as practitioners, endless struggles with what is a guideline. Is it a circular? Is it the email? Is it the instruction note? What is it? Because we every day would get emails from an official at National Treasury and we don't know what it means. So under the current bill, Section 53 says the minister may delegate to the DG of NT any power conferred on the minister except making of regulations. And then the DG can fulfill any duty in terms of this act as directed by the minister. So very broad powers given to the DG, which will obviously be delegated, meaning that we will have more of these communications and creating more confusions. So there needs to be some kind of synergy between those. Lastly, just one last one. I have a lot of others, but one other matter that I find is missing is, as you know, the procurement bill deals with the matter when you procure and when you as an organ of state give funds to a body outside of government, that body will now do their procurement under this and comply with the law. However, in the MFMA, the similar provision, Section 67, has not been repealed. Section 67, in particular, subsection 4 says, when it is a social benefit organization serving the poor, and that organization, subject to a monetary value, does not even have to keep records of the expenditure. So how are they going to audit that they complied with the law if they don't have to keep records? So those two legislation have not been repealed. Strikingly, if you look at the repeal section, it would have been interesting if Sean can put it up, that repeal provision that deals with the MFMA in that block. It is clear that when they repeal the MFMA provisions, someone did a search under the name supply chain in the MFMA. And you can see everywhere where the word supply chain appear, there is a note. And that is how the repeal were done. Not with detailed analyses of the MFMA. So we looked there, right? So you'll see there is a word, supply chain management policy. Then you need, again, supply chain. And if you go down, you will always see supply chain. So it's clear that when they considered the review, someone did a brief search on the word supply chain in the MFMA, and no other provisions that will impact on procurement have been checked. So that is striking. Anyway, thanks, Prof.
Excellent. Thanks, Raymond. I mean, many interesting points there, and undoubtedly many more, and we should definitely have a further conversation on this. I mean, I think you're absolutely right in the alignment between the MFMA and this thing. There's non-alignment, and I think a lot of thought must go into how will these two regimes sit next to each other, and that's a general point as well. I mean, it is certainly true for local government, but it's true for other regimes as well. For example, there's no clarity in my mind about how this regime is going to talk to the contemplated NHI, National Health Insurance regime, which will include massive amounts of procurement, because that whole regime is built on the idea that the state will henceforth buy all health services. But the two regimes are completely like ships in the night, passing each other. There's no indication of any alignment. National land transport, again, for the metros and for some of the larger secondary cities, places like George, for example, that run land transport systems, it's going to be a struggle, because under the Land Transport Act, there's a whole regime. And then, CETA itself, I think, is going to be faced with a lot of issues. So undoubtedly, there's a lot of alignment that still needs to be done, and I don't think it's been properly thought through. And I think this is something that it's part of our obligation to point this out specifically to Parliament, because that's Parliament's job, right? These are all enactments by Parliament, and we need to go to Parliament and sensitize them to the fact that two of your own enactments are now not talking to each other. So I think that's important. 33 is one that really interests me. And I mean, I absolutely agree with you, Raymond, that 33 serves a particular budgetary purpose. And I agree with that. I mean, even though I think it's absolutely silly in how we do these relatively short-term budgetary things in South Africa, but I mean, it's a global phenomenon, but it's certainly not conducive to a good developmental perspective, because 3 years is just too short a time frame. So I fully agree with that. But it is, as you say, the interaction between that budgetary instrument and a procurement contract becomes very complicated. And it's one that we really need to understand. And the problem is we don't understand 33 for what it is and the purpose it's meant to achieve. And as a result, we mix 33 up into the procurement regulation space where, in my view, it's not meant to play a role. But inevitably it does, because that's just, the law puts that kind of barrier in front of you. And specifically, when we are keen to accelerate development, especially infrastructure development, then it's by definition longer term contracts. It's the only way that it really can work. And if we are wanting to facilitate that, we will have to be much more agile in terms of our ability to commit to longer term contracts and giving suppliers that certainty that they would need to be able to go into a long-term contract at affordable rates, at least for the municipality. So I think that issue is one that we will definitely have to think about. And then, depending on where we fall, I think 33 will have to be tweaked to just enable us to do long-term contracting in a more feasible way, at least. And remember, this bill, even though it is very silent on it, I mean, really very few things, it's also meant to govern PPPs. So I think there's still a bit of a round peg trying to go into a square hole kind of thing.
Thanks, Prof. Geo. Thank you, Raymond. We know you have to go off to another meeting now. Let's bring in Tebogo Moromane. Hi, Tebogo.
Hi, Sean. Hello, colleagues. I think from my side, the last slide that Prof put on regarding all now the municipalities having to source through CSD and the e-tender portal. I think the one thing that needs to be put forward to the lawmakers is the availability of those portals, of those systems, because as it is especially CSD, it's a struggle for most of us to get service providers through that portal. So I'm not sure where, if they have thought about that and what is going to happen in terms of that system being able to cater for the massive volumes that will be coming through now, the municipal offices that will be now having to source through the CSD and the e-tender portal. And the second one also is the transversals, that are they going to increase the number of people that are going to do these transversal procurement at National Treasury, or how is it going to work? Because as it is now, if we partake in those transversals and there are audit findings, those audit findings also then affect the individual offices that are partaking in that transversal contract. I think for me, those are the two things that I would really love to see them addressed. Thanks.
Thanks, Tebogo. And I mean, may I just kind of abuse this opportunity to please implore you to put those things in writing and send them to Parliament, and please reflect it from your practical perspective, because it is critical, I think, that the lawmakers hear these things before they commit to a certain regime. And I'll tell you, I mean, why, and I've got no doubt that Sean will also share his views on 24 and 25 with us. But I mean, it is, whatever we think about, yes, we should go e-procurement, we should be moving, absolutely. I think we all agree with that. The point is just, it's no use putting something like this in a statute without the realistic view that it's going to be possible to do it. And so if we want to commit to something like 24 and 25 in this bill, it must go along with a serious commitment from the lawmaker, who, remember, also controls the purse strings. Parliament is the one that dishes out the money. It must then go with a serious commitment to fund the implications of 24 and 25, which is massive. And I think the same point goes to transversals. I think it will be an unmitigated disaster if this bill is adopted in the current form and we simply hand it to the current OCPO to run with. And don't misquote me on that. I'm not thereby suggesting that the current OCPO is not good or something. I'm batting for them. My point is, they are not sufficiently capacitated to deal with this. So if we want this, if we say as a country, we want this e-tender portal, we want the central system, we want more transversals, great. But then we need to put our money where our mouths are, and we need to then properly capacitate the PPO to be able to do the job. Because otherwise, I mean, I don't want to then work in that unit, because it is going to be really tough. This is a big ask that we're asking of that office in this bill. And without the commitment to capacitating that office, I think we are going to see a lot of issues. And then, I mean, the point you raise around the volumes under the current systems, I think is a good point. If we look at spending patterns, there's no doubt about the fact that local government, is really one of the big spenders, always between them and the SOCs. So again, that's something that will have to be raised to say, okay, so to what extent are these systems robust enough to be able to be, you know, geared up? And again, it's the same point. If at the moment we say, look, we're struggling because we don't have the capacity or whatever, then we need to commit to make that capacity a reality, because it's not going to happen just by writing it on paper. That, you know, that's of no use. But Sean, I know that you've got strong views on 24 and 25.
It just absolutely scares me that you know, this office must develop a single platform that complies with Section 18, and Section 18 is the entire system of procurement.
Yeah.
And to try and do that is, I think, it's just it's a big ask. But I'm sure that Scott Himon has got some perspective on this one. Good morning, Scott. Welcome, and nice to have you join us.
Hi, good morning, colleagues, Prof. Sean. I think the success factors that determine good uptake on e-procurement or e-commerce certainly would hinge on a number of things. The capacity, the infrastructure, and to some extent a little bit of flexibility on the use for different organs of state. A one-size-fits-all approach, I think we've got enough empiric evidence that hasn't worked. But I would like to argue that provision for ICT technology in a bill is absolutely necessary, and maybe some of the instruments that could be used to ensure a practical implementation would be a deferred implementation, certain exemptions until the system is at a stage of maturity it can be rolled out. Whether a single platform would be the smartest way, I think we need to deliberate, engage with the Treasury a little bit more. The IFMS is a good example of how that consolidation or centralized thinking has not yielded a positive result. But I would like to caution that we don't throw the baby with the bathwater. Modernization can be accelerated at enormous pace through the use of technology. But I would agree that to treat systems as a blunt instrument applicable to all kinds of commodities and procurement, to all organs of state, might not exactly be what this patient needs. So, Sean, maybe in our comments, if colleagues agree, we should advocate for the advancement and acceleration of e-commerce and e-commerce related functionality, and not a single product or a single platform or a single channel. And there are many examples in government where technology has been used very effectively. I'm currently with SARS, and just to give you an idea, ramping up auto assessments has resulted in 3.9 million taxpayers in 2 days submitting, processing and paying their refunds. It is possible, and we should embrace the use of technology and data management in procurement. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with you. I think we are on the same page on that regard. I mean, I mean, in previous versions, some of our comments have been that there's just not enough on e-procurement. The paradigm is not strong enough in the bill. It's still very manual in terms of its paradigm. So absolutely, I fully agree. And I think, you know, it is critical that the primary legal instrument, being the Act, makes that very clear, makes that principle very clear. There needs to be a clear, not just commitment, but actually obligation on the administrators to take it forward. I fully agree with that, and I strongly support that. And I agree with you that we've really got good examples in the country of things that work. I mean, just very recently, I was amazed at having to renew my car license. And I got an SMS message and I could link directly from the message into whoever the entity is on their own system, not my bank or whatever. They were way more efficient than any of the other institutions that I typically use to do this. Pay directly, had it couriered to my house, done. And I was really impressed with that. It was a painless, quick, really good product. So it shows you it's possible. So I agree with that. My problem is the way in which 24 and 25 has been framed at the moment, because my fear is we are prejudging a process that we must still go through. We don't know where we want to end. We know the outcome, and we know the principle, but we don't know what the appropriate tool is going to be. And I think it's a bad idea to try and write that into a statute where, you know, we go on this due diligence that they contemplate, and then we see, oh, well, actually, it might be best to have a 2-tier system or a 3 differential system or whatever. And then we boxed into the wording of the statute. So, I mean, my comment on 24 and 25 is going to be, keep the principle. But if there's any place under this bill where just a framework is properly appropriate, it's these 2 sections. And that's one of the puzzles of this bill, that in areas where I think we need more detail in the statute, it's silent. It just gives us a framework, like targeted procurement, for example. In other areas where I think a framework is probably the best approach, they give us detail, like 24 and 25. It's a little bit bizarre in my view, but I mean, I think we agree on this point.
Thanks, Bob. Thank you, Scott. I'm just going to, I see Sanele has raised his hand, but I just quickly want to invite, I'm just checking if he's still with us, Sakunzi Mwakiso. Sakunzi, I know you're deeply involved in capacity building at the local government level, and you might want to just share some thoughts that you have on what the implication might be on this, I think, fairly significant requirement that you know, those at the local government level are going to have to start taking instructions straight away and implementing them and building the capacity to start to run with them as soon as your Treasury, National Treasury and Provincial Treasury might tell them. So maybe just some thoughts that you might have, Sakunzi, if you're still with us. Now, Sanela, I think you still did raise your hand. I don't know if that's an old one or you still like to make some more comments.
Just a very brief comment, Sean, if you allow me.
Go ahead. Thank you, Sanela.
Sure. No, thanks. I think one of the things that might be beneficial with the new law for the municipalities is definitely it will change the current procurement threshold. But what I want to alert the colleagues is that definitely we do not want that to be covered by the bill. And we do not also want this that to be covered by the regulations. Why I'm saying this is because if you look at the current procurement threshold, and if you look at the current bill, it does tell you that if you issue this public procurement bill as it is, definitely you must issue regulations as soon as possible. But then it tells you that if those procurement thresholds are enshrined in the regulation, it's still going to take time for them to be amended. If there's any time to do, if there's a need to do that. So now, I would say to the colleagues at the local space, at the local government space, they need to be alert. And the regulations, when they come out for comment, we should definitely make sure that we comment that they remove the procurement thresholds from there, and they be issued in a form of instructions like the current national government is doing, National Treasury is doing for PFMA institutions. It's easier if you would issue such procurement threshold in that manner, because should you find yourself in a different economic status, you can always review that anytime. Now, going further, I would want us to look into a point of those thresholds maybe being issued by provincial treasury for the delegated municipalities and the provincial institution and the ones that are for national government being issued by National Treasury. Why I'm saying this is because National Treasury sometimes is far from the reality. And if you look at the current procurement threshold of the local government, they've been in the regulations since 2005. You still find yourself have to advertise a tender for anything above 200,000. And it tells you that since the 20 years later, no one has thought of changing that because it is a regulatory subject. So I think let's look into those things. And if we get to a point where we have to comment on the issue of the procurement threshold, let's try and create some flexibility around that at the local space, because that's where I think local government will be able to move at a higher speed. I understand that they may not want to allocate R1 million for a quotation to all the municipalities because of some obvious reasons. But I think the proposed mechanisms at least should work for the local government. Thank you.
Thanks,
Sanele, I think that's a really important point, but I mean, it's a point that you will have to raise now, because if you look at section 18 that I hope is still on the screen,
yes,
you'll see that it says there in the statute that the minister must prescribe. Now, the word prescribe under this statute means by way of regulation, right? It's defined to mean by way of regulation. So 18.1 basically says the minister must make regulations on the following, and then including procurement methods, procurement thresholds, E. So the implication of 18.1 as it is currently formulated is to take all of us into the current MFMA regime of setting the thresholds in the regulations, which, as you correctly point out, it's been a real issue in local government when compared to the PFMA, where we've had it under in an instruction and we've been able to adjust over time, and we've never been able to adjust under the MFMA regulation. So I think this is an important point to now already point out to the lawmaker, to say you want to take that out. You want to put that somewhere else and say this must be done. I mean, I would say, even though I'm not a fan of having these instruction powers at all, but if we are going to have them, I would say at least this is probably justifiable for an instruction from time to time. So I think that's a comment that we must make now on 18.1.
Thank you. Thanks, Prof. Just we'll come to yourself now, Nicholas. Richard Rapiri is with us as well, and Richard is really strong in CIDB, construction industry, and we'll just invite Richard to come on if he's got any perspectives on what Prof is raising. And also, I think there's some interesting implications there on the methods side and construction. That might be an interesting one. CIDB has really got a whole bunch of methods. What might the implications be that we've got to wait now for Treasury to tell the institutions that these are the methods? So let's jump to Nicholas. Nicholas Diaz, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Scott. I just have two quick thoughts on transversal, the imposition of transversal procurement on municipalities. The first is cost effectiveness. I mean, it proceeds from the presumption that because it's going to be national, that it's going to be cheaper, but that's not necessarily a guarantee. Over a course of 3 years, it might be that one or another particular municipality could get the goods or services cheaper for their particular circumstances. And so the question to me is that's coming to me is it undermining cost effectiveness in terms of 217, and the other one is fairness and equity and preferential goals and the rest. All of that's going to be undermined if the municipality is not able to take control of the procurement for the particular goods or services and implement what would be their goals for their municipality. It'll all be then determined by national, if I'm understanding how this is going to roll out.
Thank you, Nicholas. Prof?
Yeah, I think those are really good points. I mean, I think there's undoubtedly a tension there between, so there's a design tension, right? In reality, it might work out perfectly, but one doesn't think about, one can't think at that level. You must think at the design level here. And there's a design tension between extending power at a national level while maintaining other things at a decentralized, localized level. I think there are at least, I mean, there are more, but there are at least two things that worries me here. The first one is the paradigm of keeping your accounting officer as the final accountable, responsible person. And in the case of local government, that's the MM, right? Now, how realistic is it, or even fair is it, to try and keep the MM accountable for procurement if increasingly procurement decisions are taken centrally and they just become an implementation agent, not even an implementation agent, just a user, right? Then surely you cannot hold that MM accountable for that expenditure. So that's the first problem, and there's a tension there. The second very specific problem is if you look at section 17, which is the one that deals with targeted procurement, that adopts this very much the current approach we've got under the 2022 regulations, where we say you decide what you want to do, including localization, including what we've never done, localization in your own backyard, meaning your municipality. Now, how do we square that with increased transversal contracting? How do we square the fact that we say to a municipality, you're free to design your own targeted procurement based on your context? Might be that you want to primarily contract with a contractor in your geographical area, but then at the same time, we take away a big chunk and we prescribe to you that you're going to use this panel or you're going to get it from this contract. And there's a tension there that's difficult to square at a design level. And I've just pulled up on the screen, Sean, in kind of, response to your comments about the CIDB, some of the really interesting amendments that they're proposing on the CIDB Act. And I think those are really important for the folks in the construction space to really think about what are the implications going to be. And if I just look at that first one on the screen, the insertion of one capital A in section 5, which inserts the public procurement office into the decision-making processes, really the power of the board, and note specifically the word in consultation. Now, in law, that is a term of art. When you say in consultation, it means both parties must agree before you can go forward. After consultation does not mean that. After consultation means the first one, the one that's consulting, must just listen, but then can take the decision. Now, the way this is framed means that the board is basically giving up its own power to do this this development and uniformity thing. They are henceforth beholden to the PPO to be able to do this, and that's a significant shift, right? That's not a quick thing. So again, a lot of shifts happening in how this is going to play out.
Very interesting. Prof, I wonder if I could come back to a point that you raised right up front, and that is how councils are effectively going to be taken out of the process. I don't know if you could share with us why that was originally done with MFMA, because if I recall, MFMA followed PFMA, and why was that originally done, and what might some of the implications be of this? And I'm thinking also of this politically. The whole points that Nicholas has raised around location and the development of the municipality and those kinds of things. Any thoughts? Do you recall why it was done initially?
Yeah. So my understanding of that aspect of the MFMA was very much linked to how, at that stage at least, we had this vision of shifting our local government into a fully fledged third level of state, not just as in the pre-94 era, the implementing agent of national and provincial, really a freestanding, under its own power, and that reflects the Constitution, right? That's why I think it is really important to think, when you think about procurement under the Constitution, local government, you can't just look at 217. You must look at the substantive mandate of municipalities that's going to be implemented by way of procurement. And that's part of the story. And I think that's part of the reason why at that stage the thinking was that it's the elected representatives on the ground that needs to have the power to really control these implementing instruments. They need to be able to make it work within the reality of that particular community, bearing in mind that there are huge differentials in our country between different communities in this particular respect, not just in terms of what kind of services must immediately be rendered, but also how it can be rendered. I mean, if you are talking, and some of the colleagues have raised this, if you're talking with a colleague from a deep rural municipality, you cannot compare the experience of that procurement official with one sitting in a metro. And even between the metros, it's not the same. I mean, we've got metros and we've got metros, right? So I think it is part of that conceptualization that democracy, as we conceptualize it, is very much participatory. It's very much for the context, for the particular people. We want the people themselves to be in control of their own destiny. And the body that is, politically the best place to do that is the council, because they're directly elected. It's people you can see them, they're there. So I think the idea, and that kind of underlies the entire MFMA, was really to put all of that within the control of the council. Of course, what we're seeing now is a kind of a reaction to a number of things, one of which undoubtedly is abuse, and whether it's corruption or other forms of abuse, of course, it's all going on. So we're seeing a lot of that, and it worries us. So we want to kind of try and remove it. We see a lack of capacity, so we again worried. We see influence, So I think that's the kind of thinking at the moment. I do think, however, there's something to be said for the fact that this was always a kind of a design anomaly in our system, where it's not the same at the other levels. So it's a little bit strange how it was conceptualized here. I also think it's linked to our continued uncertainty, vagueness, whatever you want to call it, at a conceptual level around what is an SCM policy. And I think, that's something that we introduced with the MFMA. It didn't exist prior to the MFMA. It was only the MFMA that introduced it. And then even under the PFMA, we started talking about SCM policies. But to this day, we don't really know what an SCM policy is. Is it an implementing instrument? Well, then it's, of course, not a policy, right? Then it's a plan. Or is it truly a policy, something that gives a strategic direction? Well, then it's a policy. Then you can't enforce it. Or is it a set of rules? It's just a manual. It's a set of rules. And it's probably all of these, depending on which context, which section you're looking at, etc., etc. But I think it's part of that thing, that we're not conceptually clear on what an SCM policy is. And one conceptualization is that we thought about an SCM policy almost as a bylaw. It's almost a little piece of legislation for the local government. And that's why it would be appropriate then to give it to the council. But of course, we know that, SCM policy is probably not to be compared to a bylaw. It's more an implementation instrument. It's more an administrative executive kind of instrument, which then raises the question whether it is suitable to give that to the council. So I think that's the space. Politically, of course, it is a really hot potato. I'm just absolutely amazed that it continues to be below the radar. I mean, perhaps I'm just not plugged in, but if I'm a local government politician, this would be something that would be of real political concern to me. Not just generally, but specifically now in where we are now in our political life of our country. So I'm quite amazed that there's not a lot of political hoo-ha around that shift.
I mean, on the political side, we've got national provincial elections happening early next year, but this is going to be implemented just before local government elections.
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting.
And if you then add to that the really open-ended powers granted essentially to the national and provincial government, executive government, not even the legislature, the executive government, the PPO and the provincial treasury, that becomes quite a thing, right? And it's powers they can use a little bit, they can be very light touch, or they can be very heavy-handed. If you think, for example, about the open-ended nature of transversal contracting, we can shift back to an old state tender board system overnight with this regulatory regime because it gives the powers, and there will be nothing that municipalities can do about that.
I have one more question to ask you, and that is, it seems to me that it is placing even more onus on the SEM teams at a local government level to have to operate as many of their colleagues in PFMA do, to really interpret this legislation that they're going to be getting through and then put it into something which is, you know, procedurally implementable within the municipality. And one of the key things that always sticks with me is the Zondo Commission's recommendation to centralize. And yeah, we all say that's not necessarily practical, but the reason they suggested that was because we do not have sufficient competence and capacity across these hundreds of entities that we've got. And I don't see this addressing it. In fact, I see it making it even worse. I see it placing more onus on a stretched SEM competence and capacity at local government level.
Yeah, I agree. I agree, especially in the short term. Look, in the long term, if we're able to realize some of the more ambitious things that's in the statute, I think it will be positive and it will definitely take us forward, no doubt. But in the short and medium term, I think there's going to be a lot of heightened uncertainty, a lot of heightened or increased space for interpretation where there just isn't something and somebody must make a judgment call about what does this mean, and then all the issues that come with that, taking into account that we'll have a new dispute resolution mechanism that in many respects will make it easier to challenge decisions. So I think in that regard, we are undoubtedly going to see more, obligations being placed, more expectations of SEM teams across the country, which I think will be a challenge. Part of that story is I think that there's not enough in the bill to make it absolutely clear around the level of professionalization that we need and that must be implemented. I think it's too discretionary, it's too open-ended, because I think those two things go hand in hand. I also think that part of the problem is the differential, and it links a little bit to something that Skalk said earlier as well, the differential between wanting to do something that seems sensible, but then falling into the trap of actually doing something else. And it's the difference between uniformity, for example, and single. Now, uniform and single, not the same thing. And often we make that mistake. We think that when we consolidate and we want something to be uniform, it means it's one size fits all. No, it's not. There can be differentiation within a uniform system. Perfect. What I think Zondo was really after when they suggested all of the centralization thing, which I'm not in favor of at all, is more simplification. So we need a single system. That's not the same rules for everyone. One system and a simplified system. Do away with the complexity, with the too many things at the same time. Make it a simplistic system, but one that meaningfully differentiates between different contexts within the single system. Then I think we are moving forward. If we can get there, we move forward. And I've been a big fan, and I continue to advocate for it, that what we need in probably all our regulatory regimes, but certainly in procurement, is we need a proper maturity model system. We need a system that can differentiate between different maturity levels of different entities. And that's not based on, you know, which level of government you're at, or which province you're at, or which sector. It's on your maturity, your administrative maturity. In this case, your financial and planning maturity. And we need a mechanism that's linked to that and that can move you up and down in terms of how tightly you're controlled, or how much freedom and flexibility you've got to get on with it. I don't see anything like this here. I think it's a pity, it's a missed opportunity. I, for one, would be advocating very strongly that we start to think about that type of system, where it's a single system, but with differentiation linked to maturity levels.
Interesting. Adrienne de Kock, you've raised your hand, and we'll give you the last chance. Last question.
Oops. Unmute. Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Prof. I would just like to comment on what you have said regarding the centralization that makes you nervous. We in the Western Cape Health Department feel very much the same about this in particular. However, I despair that OCPO or National Treasury is going to get this right. With all due respect to colleagues that might be attached to that department that might be on this platform today, we have recently implemented and had extensive training for the use of the new e-tender portal, which initially was supposed to be an instrument for advertising bids. It is now everything and an instrument to advertise bids. It is so complex. It has so many functions. It's that I feel sometimes that it's not fit for purpose. It has replaced a system that ran through the government printers for decades, and I've been in the service for that long. That worked perfectly well. That was very simple for everybody to understand, didn't require any kind of training, and worked. It did what it was supposed to do. You sent it away a week in advance, and your bid would be advertised a week later. There was no uploading documents, uploading your APP, etc., etc., etc. So the point I'm trying to make in a roundabout way is, if this needs to be done, and it needs to be simplified in the way that you suggest, I don't know that OCPO or NT would be the people to do it. If they are going to do that job in the same way as they have done this e-tender portal, then it is going to contain everything and the kitchen sink. It is going to be incredibly complex and confusing. People are going to make endless mistakes, and in the end, it is going to make things worse, not better. Thank you.
Thanks, Adrienne. I mean, I think that's a fair point, and I think, you know, it's a general point about the design of the entire regulatory regime, and that's something that I'm going to say very loudly to Parliament as well, is that it's not in our interest to over-design anything. It's not, and we shouldn't try and do so. What do we stand to gain from that? So we need to start at the lowest level of implementability at the moment. That's the starting point, not the highest level. Don't think about the smartest procurement outfit in the country. Think about the most stretched one, and start to design a system that can make their lives easier and their procurement better. That's the starting point. Let's start there. And then we build over time, and we take the people with us over time. But at the same time, what we cannot afford is for those that are already kind of, you know, racehorses, they're already running far ahead of the rest, to say to them, oh no, come back, sorry, no, unlearn everything you've learned, stop being so smart, come back here. We don't want that. That's not in the interest of our country. And we also don't want this thing that seems to become now the popular, just exempt them. Whenever it becomes too difficult, exempt them. Then they're on their own and we throw them out and we don't worry. It doesn't work. Let's design a system where we can leave room and scope for those that are far down this journey to do their thing. Because they're the earlier uptakers. They're the ones that's going to experiment, from which they're the pilots. We're going to learn from them. But we can't open that door to everyone. But let's not try and do it in a one. I mean, this is what Skalk said. Let's not try and do this in a one-size-fits-all. Let's just be meaningfully differentiated. And we try and do both ends. There's no reason why we can't do both sides. So I think that's a message that we need to try and get across to the lawmaker, to say, that's the paradigm that we want in the statute. What the detail we can work out, and we will always disagree on the detail. But that's not the point where we now. We want this paradigm. We want you as the legislature to give the executive the instruction that this is how we want you to proceed. This is what we want you to achieve in terms of the system that 217 talks about. And my worry is that while there are great things in this bill that I think will take us forward, it's not enough. There's work still to be done to get that paradigm really kind of anchored into a new piece of legislation.
Thank you. Thanks, Prof. Thanks, Adrian. Prof, just in closing, we don't have a lot of time. The submissions to Parliament have to be done by midday on the 11th of September. It's days away before we have to make a submission. To someone who's sitting here now, your advice on what format, what form that submission should make. If they picked on something simple, just section 33, and they'd like to make a comment, how should they do that? What's the best format and form that they should do that in?
Okay, so my first point is, do not be put off by worries about format. If that's going to stop you from making a submission, forget about it. Just put it in an email and send it through. Just don't worry about it. Just type it up and send it through. So please do not let concerns about format prohibit you from making a submission. The bottom line is that Parliament must consider everything they get, whether it's on a little scribbled piece of paper or a 50-page dissertation. They must consider it. So that's the first point. So do not think that you're not smart enough and you don't know this is lawyerly stuff and you don't know what. Forget about that. Put your thoughts on paper, send it through, right? So that's the first point. However, the typical way to do this, to make it easier for yourself and to have potentially a bigger impact, is to do it in columns. So take the statute or the bill, work through it, identify those particular sections you want to talk to. So try not to talk general about the whole thing and the whole procurement system, and stay away from that, because that's very difficult for a lawmaker to deal with. They're dealing with a particular document in front of them. So if you're just talking about the whole system and there's not enough flexibility, and they're not going to understand where those comments are relevant. So use the bill as your starting point. So in the first column of your document, you put the actual section you're dealing with, the number. So I want to comment on section 18(1)(a). Then in the next column, put your comment in. So if I think about procurement methods, I see here that in 18(1)(e), it says that the minister must prescribe thresholds. I think that is problematic, because thresholds shouldn't be set in regulations. This is why I think so. And then in the next column, you make a proposal. You say, I would suggest that the power to create threshold should rather be left to an instruction. And if you want to be really smart, you don't have to, but if you want to be really smart, add another column and give them new wording. Say to them, I think therefore the section should read like this. Or I think you should delete this, add the following to whatever other section to fix whatever my problem is. You don't have to go there. It's not your job, it's their job. But this is how you can help them to think through the problem. But always start with the very specific section, either just the section number or even the word in the section that you want to comment on. And the trick is, the closer you can tie your comment and your input to a very specific something in the document, the bigger impact you're going to have, because the lawmaker will understand that. They will have something to deal with. They can say, okay, so this section says this is what people are saying about this section. And we can then have a conversation about it and give them that conversation. Tell them, why is it? So take the threshold example that, that we've had. Explain to them the problem. They won't understand it. They're not procurers. Explain to them that there's been this 200 threshold. This is the reason why it's problematic. Give them even figures if it helps. So that is the part where you really enable them to sit in your chair and to understand what the implication of this is. The more detail you can give them there, the better. But you start by linking it to the very particular section. And then in the end, make a recommendation. Say something. Say, I think this is a bad idea. I think this should be left out. Or I think it needs to be tweaked. Or I like it. And remember to also say that. When you think there's something in the bill that you think is positive and it's important that we have that, say that. Because there might be somebody else that's making a submission that's saying this thing should be deleted. And if they only hear that, then they're not getting the full picture. If you feel, no, it's important that whatever, say that. And explain to them why it will be important and it will be useful to have this in the context. So that is the format that we typically use, and I would do that. It also, I always think, help to just right at the beginning of your submission, like any good application letter for a job, just say a little bit about who you are and why you think that they should actually pay some attention to what you've got to say. I think, you know, in these kind of processes, if you say to them, look, I'm a procurement official in, you know, Amatole district municipality. I've done this for 10 years. That carries weight. That's important. Any, you know, sensible lawmaker looking at that will think, well, I need to take this seriously. This person knows what they're talking about. So I would also say, just put that at the top and then you do your thing.
Very good. Very good. Thank you. Hi, Heinrich, you've raised your hand. Welcome. All right, looks like you have unmuted, but we're not hearing you. So just see if you can play a little bit with your microphone there, Heinrich, or put a question into the comment. And while Heinrich is trying to get that going, they've set aside 2 days for you know, public hearings on Zoom. Who are the ones that should apply for that? If I am an individual in the municipality and I'd like to have my say, would they schedule me, or is this just going to be for the Prof Geo Quinot of the world in making those?
Yeah, look, as you know, Sean, I've got a major scheduling issue with those dates, so I still need to work out how I'm gonna wing that, but we'll wing it in some way. Look, no, I mean, I think it's important. Just as I think it's important for the lawmaker to just get those inputs from right across the country, I think it's important that they hear from everyone. In this particular case, I think it is important that, especially those very experienced procuring officers, those that's been around the block a few times, that they do apply to be heard. I think it doesn't only kind of, you know, really bring that message across, but it also enables the committee to have access to a resource where they can ask questions. So making yourself really available to the committee is really what it's all about. Because, I mean, you get the opportunity to put your input in writing, so you don't really need the appearing before the committee to just basically, you know, emphasize the points. I always think of it as an opportunity to assist the committee members where they may have questions, they may want to probe something. So I always, when I make submissions and then decide, am I going to apply to appear or not, that's my point of departure. Do I think that there's something I can bring to the committee that they might want to engage me with, that I've got some knowledge that I can help them? And I think you must decide that for yourself. They do, however, take a very small number usually. They look at what are the kind of issues that you can specifically help them with based on your written submissions. And they will also not just take, 20 that's all basically saying the same point. They will pick and think, okay, we take these two, they will probably give us the best insight on this issue. And then also they try to get some kind of balance between, views. This is not necessarily such a controversial piece of legislation, so I'm not sure whether there are, vastly opposing views on any specific issue here. But if in a legislative process you do have something like that, I mean, the quintessential example, of course, is abortion. If you adopt abortion legislation, it'll be unthinkable if you don't have both sides of that major debate physically there. As a legislature, you just can't do that. So that is also one principle that they apply. I mean, I think if you think that you can help the committee apply, just say that you would like to appear, and they will let you know. It will be virtual, right? So you don't have to come down to Parliament. They don't have a building anymore to sit in. So it'll all be virtual.
Thank you. Emla Settler, you've unmuted. I wondered if you wanted to ask a question, and then Heinrich has put his question down. Western Cape Provincial Treasury has shared a template with municipalities, among others, that can use the draft to submit their comments in a structured manner that they will consolidate all comments from province to Parliament. So that's a good point there. Thanks very much for that. So you are in the Western Cape. You've got an opportunity to have Western Cape Provincial Treasury consolidate your comments into those with the rest.